Welcome back. We are talking with Regina Phelps once again. Regina, lots of information there about RSV, and now we get to talk about avian influenza.
We do indeed. This is so funny. I'm having a big deja vu moment. I first got initially very interested in pandemics and pandemic planning by speaking at the World Conference on Disaster Management in Toronto in 1997.
I was in the audience. I remember that.
So I actually started all of this work in influenza in the late 90s. And it was all based on the fact that there was this huge outbreak of avian influenza that was really rolling around Asia. And so this is just a deja vu moment. We are really having a really significant outbreak of avian influenza worldwide. And you may say, well, who cares, Regina, because it's only affecting birds. It's like, well, yes, I'm a bird watcher and it makes me sad, but I want to say to you that avian influenza is actually a huge potential impact to humans because it's one of those diseases that can jump without much effort into a human. And then if it mutates at all in the recipient of that new disease, and it actually mutates and becomes able to be transmitted from one human to the next, then we have a potential pandemic. Mm-hmm. Already this morning, I was following this particular issue on a site that I follow every day. I actually get an email of every awful disease in the world sent to me. And I might have talked about it before with our listeners, but there's a site called Pro Med, M-E-D, Mail, M-A-I-L, like sending a letter, .org. And it's an infectious disease site that's actually managed by Harvard. And they actually produce amazing information every day on diseases all over the world. And as a planner, continuity planner professional, you might say, well, I never used to really think much about diseases. But what I want to say to you is that we are a global community. And as we learned from COVID, if you didn't know already, whatever starts one place doesn't mean it's going to stay there. And so it's important that everybody have some sense just in the background what might be going on. Avian flu is a big deal right now globally. And I also want to say is that why I mentioned ProMed Mail this morning is that they had a post about a mink farm in the Netherlands that actually was infected with avian influenza because, again, it's one of those things that probably a wild bird who was ill was in a farm area where these minks were being farmed, and sure enough, got ill, and now it's spreading throughout this population of minks that will have to be exterminated. And then where there's a chance for transmission to a human is where culling occurs, either birds or things like minks. And if they don't have the right protective equipment on, they can inhale that virus into their lungs, and there's an opportunity for that person to become sick, which has happened already. And then it may mutate, which then it could cause a pandemic. So that's why this is actually a big deal. The avian outbreak that we're having right now is one of the most significant we've had in many years. This is a new form of a virus and actually infects not only wild birds, but domestic poultry. So chickens, think of eggs, think of if you eat chicken or turkeys. They're forecasting that there will not be many Thanksgiving turkeys here in November in the United States because of this outbreak and the culling in domestic flocks. And you just had your Thanksgiving, and my Canadian colleagues have said that turkeys were hard to find and expensive. Was that your experience?
That was very true. The freezers were half full, if that. And a lot of times you saw the price of what was available and decided to make a roast or a ham.
Yep. Exactly right. Yeah, it's actually really a big deal. So when you look at, of course, there's so much conversation about inflation and the cost of food and everything right now. And everybody may blame their political leaders, but I would like to say to everybody, it's really driven by several major things: the Ukraine war, COVID, and things like the avian flu, which is why birds are not available domestically in stores and why eggs are so expensive, et cetera. There's just a lot of things all convening at the same time, making it very difficult. So these cullings have been going on, not just in the United States, but in Canada and other parts of the world. It's been killing millions of domesticated birds. There's been bans on exports and imports. There's less eggs being produced, less turkeys, and less chickens overall. And this is the largest outbreak since 2015, of which 50 million birds in the US were infected. And already there's been 47.6 million birds infected in the US. So it's in 42 states. It's spread primarily by wild birds moving through a community and in migration, and just by their presence in the community when they're, possibly mixing with domesticated birds, or actually just even being in a field next to a domesticated bird flock is enough to actually infect that flock. So it's a big deal.
That's a good point you just made, because the time of year we are right now,
Migration.
migration is occurring right now. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and so this means that it moves everywhere, right? So when this really started in the spring, it was all the birds sort of moving through, and then they got to their summering grounds. Now they're coming back. They're infected or becoming infected, and they're infecting other birds along the way, and that's how it works. The way this is spread is that these infected birds will shed this flu through their saliva, their mucus, and their feces. And then if it gets into a human, so think of somebody that's a farm worker or something like that, they pick up a bird. Maybe they have a mask on, maybe they don't, but then they scratch their nose or something like that. And that's how you can have this transmission between species. This particular slide shows you of the human transmissions that have occurred so far, going way back actually to the late 90s. There's only been a few so far in the United States, one in Colorado. There was another suspected one actually in Minnesota, not confirmed yet. There was a death just yesterday, a case in a 5-year-old kid in Vietnam reported yesterday who's in serious condition. And again, these are these opportunities where a human gets sick. There's always the potential for this to jump to another person. This is actually an interesting site that you can see. This is on CDC's website, and they actually talk about the human transmission and also the amount of disease transmission. And you can see there was a lot in 2015. It's just starting right now. Which that ties to the other part of the influenza story, the one that we're used to very much as humans, and that's human influenza. This year, it is forecasted, this may sound very familiar to you, this year it is forecasted that we have a really good opportunity to have a twindemic, or what's called florona, if you like that term better. And that's where we're having both a widespread issue related to influenza, but also SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. And when we actually develop the flu vaccines and we try and do forecasting for the fall flu season here in North America, we always, first of all, look to the south to see what's going on or what happened with our southern hemisphere colleagues. And Australia and New Zealand have a very good reporting system, and we look often to them as a headline about what to expect. Now, influenza mutates all the time, and so it changes a lot often by the time it leaves the southern hemisphere and moves to the north. But the experience they had in Australia and New Zealand was it was a bad flu season. Many more infections, many more deaths. And so what we need to take from that is that we have the possibility of having the same thing happen. And just like RSV, this is, of course, a respiratory illness. We've all had many cases of flu. By the time you're, 30, 40, 50 years old, you've had many cases of the flu. And generally, for most people, it is simply a mild cold-like illness. But for people over the age of 65 and for kids under the age of 2, it's a big deal. And again, that's something to keep in mind. This is going to sound a little bit like RSV as we talk about it, but it's really important to keep that in the back of your mind. There are two kinds of flu influenza. There's type A and type B, and these are primarily the flu viruses that we see circulating each year. So who's at risk for these particular outbreaks? Individuals who are most risk, as I mentioned earlier, are exactly the same as RSV. So under the age of 2, over the age of 65, transmission exactly the same. So it's respiratory droplets, also aerosol, and also fomites touching things. So this is where hand washing is really important. Good hygiene. And if you have somebody sick in your house, things like cleaning surfaces, even like doorknobs, is really good. There are 3 things that you want to keep in the back of your mind to protect you and your family safe from influenza. The first is to get your flu shot. The second is all the things that we have learned very well from COVID, which is good respiratory and hand hygiene. So, for example, if you're in an area where there's a lot of flu and transmission, and maybe you might be a little bit more susceptible or of having a bad outcome, maybe you're going to keep a mask on, and maybe you would avoid areas where there's lots of people. You would sort of have your COVID hat on in order to protect yourself from the flu. Normally, we haven't done that. But because we haven't had much flu in the last few years, people are very concerned that this one may really knock a lot of people out, even those that are young, again, between the ages of 2 and 65, and not just the young and the old. The last thing, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that I've had a few work colleagues in Western Canada who have recently been experiencing the flu, and all the COVID tests, if they can get their hands on anything, are saying that no, it's not COVID. It's not COVID.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's they don't fall in the parameters of RSV, and so I wouldn't be surprised if they're now being hit with the flu.
Yeah.
You know, the proper flu, and you know their whole households have been getting sick.
And it's much earlier. Again, this is normally an after things, usually after Halloween, and more like around Thanksgiving in America's time frame. I know you guys are earlier than us, but it's one that we're seeing more of, and we're seeing it faster now. And so this is really an important thing for people to think about. You might have said, okay, you know, I never get the flu shot. It's not a big deal. I'm young. But this year could be very different because, again, most people haven't had it in a few years. Your immune system is less tweaked by being exposed to it, and it could be a rough ride, which leads to the issues if you do become sick, and if you are any person who might have a bad outcome. Let's say you have asthma, or you have other lung conditions, or you know, you don't always do necessarily well. What you might want to be thinking about right away is if you do have the flu, and the flu, you know, is one of those things that it's very characteristic by a high temperature, and people feel like they were hit by a truck. It's not just where you're sniffling and you got, you know, your nose is running and you have a cough. The flu is a very different animal. When you get the flu, it's like, yes, I have the flu. Really severe fatigue, really severe body aches. You'll often have a spike of a fever. Your lungs are really inflamed. You have a cough. You feel like hell. That's really the flu. And so there is a drug called Tamiflu that's available. That's an antiviral, now that we all know what antivirals are. This is one that can be very helpful if you are ill with the flu, and you need to start taking it in a timely manner. So once you're really laid out, you need to call your doc and see if you can get Tamiflu if you're concerned about that. I've taken it before, and it often will just really make a huge difference in the length of the illness that you have and how fast you recover. So it'd be something to think about if you're concerned about your outcomes in having the flu. So when are the people with the flu contagious? You know, we had this big debate, of course, as you well recall from COVID. And the problem with COVID is that people were infectious for several days before they became symptomatic. Flu is a little similar, meaning that you usually begin to actually become infectious about a day before you're symptomatic. It's not quite as profound as COVID, but close. And you can actually be actually infectious, meaning spewing a virus for 5 to 7 days. That's a long time. So I don't know if you remember before the pandemic. Remember, people always used to go to work sick?
Oh yeah, I hated being on the train to go to work because there was always 3 or 4 people coughing and hacking away.
Right,
trying to be the work hero.
I hope that's one of the things that we might have learned from COVID, is that being sick and going to work or hanging out with a lot of people is really not the smartest thing. I mean, you may feel you're being heroic, but it's not helping anybody, and it's making a lot of people sick. And so if you have any symptoms, COVID related, flu related, in the course of this winter, please stay home. Please don't go out. You know, just be aware of that, you know, a day before those symptoms came out for COVID and the flu, and a little bit longer for COVID, you're going to be infectious. And that goes on for about 5 to 7 days. And again, that's really a big concern societally. Symptoms actually begin really in that 2 to 4 day range. So you're infectious. And then once you start actually getting that disease starting to really take hold, you're going to be able to infect anybody. And that's something that you really want to keep in the back of your mind. Now, one of the things that's important for most people to think about is, when should I get my flu shot? Well, let me just share there's one good thing to keep in mind, is that you want to really look at your flu shot around Halloween. There's a reason for that. Many times people will get it much earlier, but the problem is it loses efficacy fast, about 10 to 12% a month. And the flu season normally is around at its peak, usually between December and February. That's kind of the usual. So if you get it really early, then that means that you're not going to have that big punch as much as you need it when the winter really rolls in. So generally it's recommended as around Halloween, is a good time to really think about getting your flu shot because of this loss of efficacy. Now, other things that people will always say to me is, okay, Regina, I got the flu shot and I still got the flu. Yes, that happens. Hopefully we learned that with COVID. You can be vaccinated and still get the illness. But just like in COVID, when you get vaccinated, what happens is you have protection. Now, you may say that's ridiculous, I still got sick, but you may have gotten much sicker if you didn't have the actual vaccine. So don't say like, oh, why bother because I still got sick. No, it could have actually saved you from getting much worse. I just want to mention just a couple of other things. I know we're sort of moving into the middle of our segment here. There's a great site, and I would encourage even your Canadian colleagues. I don't know if there's something similar, and maybe you can do a homework and tell me if there is. There's something here in the United States called the CDC Flu Weekly. It's a great site, and this will be, you can put it in the show notes as well for those people that hear us by radio versus on YouTube. And what you can see is that every week the CDC tells you what's going on with flu in the United States. They have lots of great details, but I pulled out 2 of them I thought the listeners would want to see. One is there's a map of the United States that has color indices that show you where flu is really active right now. And the other is actually looking at clinical laboratory tests, and you can kind of see what's happening. And what you'll see literally is that you're looking at a flu season that goes from May of 2022 through October 15th of 2022. And what it looks like is a big U. So what you'll see that the flu season was late last year, and that it really was quite high still in May, and then it dropped pretty rapidly. No flu or very little flu during the summer is what we would expect. And already it's really ramping up significantly here in the United States. And the map also shows that there are some states in particular that have a lot of flu going on, and they're noted by being red in color. So you look at states like Massachusetts, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, and other parts of the state are really lighting up. So if you're in the southern part of the United States, and I would say also if you're in the north, because if Massachusetts is on fire, it won't take long for everybody else to be up there, that you want to make sure that you get your flu shot now. If you're more in the west, you might be able to wait till much closer to Halloween, but that's something you want to be thinking about when to get your flu shot. And on that note, maybe we should stop and then take a break, and then we'll talk about the subvariants. How's that?
Sounds good. And I just got my flu shot.
Good.
I
Good
just
timing.
got it. So
I'm getting my next on Wednesday, actually.
On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment, talking with Regina Phelps today, and we will be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.